Hey guys, tonight we are going to talk about the medieval underworld and about all the people in that old world who drew the short straw, starting with the thief, who had, I think, one of the very worst deals of anyone in history. And I want to say something about how we are going to do this right at the start, because the subject could go badly wrong at this hour. When people talk about medieval crime and punishment, they usually go straight for the grisly bits and dwell on them at length with a certain relish. We are not going to do that. I will tell you honestly what happened to people who were caught, because it is part of the story and you would notice if I hid it. But I will tell it briefly and plainly and then move along, and I will not linger over anything unpleasant, and there will be nothing in tonight's tale designed to make you wince in the dark. So, before you get comfortable, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always 2 in the morning somewhere. Also, thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are. And if this channel helps you drift off, tap the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim those lights, switch on a fan for some sweet background hum, and get comfortable, because we have a long and gentle journey ahead of us tonight, back through the centuries, back through the long, quiet dark, 700 years or so, to a small English village on an ordinary evening, where somebody is about to make a very bad decision. Before we talk about crime, we have to talk about the village, because the village is the reason the whole thing was so hopeless. And if you understand the village, you understand everything else that follows. A medieval village was small. Not small in the way we say a place is small now, meaning a few thousand people. Small in the sense that everybody in it knew everybody else in it, completely, by name, by face, by voice, by family, by reputation, going back generations. A village might hold a couple of hundred souls, some held far fewer, and the people in it had, in the overwhelming majority of cases, been born there, and their parents had been born there, and their grandparents, and they would die there and be buried in the same churchyard as all of them. So think about what that means for anonymity, which is the first and most essential requirement of any successful thief. There was none. There was no anonymity whatsoever, not a scrap of it. Everyone knew your face, everyone knew your walk, everyone knew your voice and your family and your reputation, and whether you were the sort of person who might do a thing like this, and where you had been yesterday, and who you had been drinking with, and whether you had come into money lately that you could not account for. You could not be a stranger. That is the thing. In your world, you are surrounded by strangers all day long, and it is so normal that you never think about it. And it means you can do almost anything in public without a single person being able to identify you afterward. You are anonymous by default. You have to work quite hard to be known. In the village, it was precisely the other way around. You were known by default, totally and permanently and inescapably. And to be unknown, you would have to travel a very long way indeed, on foot, to somewhere nobody had ever seen your face. And then you would have a different and worse problem, which we will come to, which is that a stranger in a medieval village was the most suspicious thing that anybody had ever seen. And the houses had no locks worth the name, and the doors often stood open, and people wandered in and out of one another's lives constantly, and there was no privacy at all, and every single thing that anybody did was seen by somebody and told to somebody else and remembered. So here is the medieval thief's fundamental problem. Before he has even reached out his hand, he is going to commit his crime in a world with no anonymity, among people who have known him since birth, in a community where everything is witnessed and everything is remembered and nothing at all is private. Whatever he takes will be recognized, because everybody knows everybody's possessions too. Whoever sees him will know him. And the moment he is missed, the moment the thing is missed, there will be exactly one obvious question, which is who has been behaving oddly lately, and there will be a very short list of answers. That is the world he has to work in, and it is about to get considerably worse for him, because in a moment somebody is going to notice and start shouting. Let that small and utterly unprivate village settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what happened the moment a theft was discovered, which was one of the strangest and most effective systems ever invented. The moment a crime was discovered, the victim did not go and find a policeman, because there were no policemen. The victim opened their mouth and screamed. And this was not merely a natural human reaction. This was the law. It was called raising the hue and cry, and it was a formal legal procedure that happened to consist of shouting as loudly as you possibly could. You cried out, you raised the alarm, you shouted thief or stop or whatever the local form of words was, at the top of your lungs, and the whole community heard you. And here is the part that makes it extraordinary, and that makes it so much more frightening than a police force. Everyone who heard you was legally required to drop what they were doing and join the chase. Not encouraged to, not asked to, required to by law on pain of punishment. Every able-bodied person within earshot had to abandon their work that instant and pursue the criminal, and keep pursuing from village to village if necessary, until the person was caught or had escaped clean out of the district. And if you heard the hue and cry and did not join it, if you kept your head down and went on with your ploughing and let the thief run past you, then you yourself had broken the law and could be fined for it, and in some circumstances worse. So the medieval thief was not being chased by 3 constables. He was being chased by everyone, every man, woman, and grown child within the sound of a human voice, all of whom knew the countryside far better than he did, all of whom were legally obliged to catch him, and none of whom had anything better to do than run him down. And this was formalized over time, tightened up, written into statute. The Statute of Winchester in 1285 laid it out properly, made the obligations clear, required communities to keep the peace, and pursue felons and answer for it if they did not. It was a system built entirely out of ordinary people, with no police at its centre at all, and it worked precisely because it enlisted every single person in the country as an unpaid and legally compelled constable. Think about the terror of that. If you were the one running, it is not a chase from an institution. It is a chase from a society. The whole world you have lived in your whole life, everyone you know, all of them turned instantly into a pack behind you, shouting, because the law says they must. And I find something quite beautiful in it too, oddly, underneath the fear, because it says something about how they understood community, that justice was not somebody else's job, that it belonged to everyone, that it was a shared and mutual thing, that if you heard someone in trouble, you were obliged to run toward it and not away. We have handed all that over to professionals now, and there are good reasons for that, but something was lost too, and the hue and cry is the ghost of it. Let that great shout, and the whole village running, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to something even more inescapable than the chase, which was the group of men who had to answer for you personally. Here is where the medieval thief's life becomes genuinely impossible, and it is one of the strangest legal arrangements that has ever existed, and almost nobody knows about it. Every man in the village was in a gang of 10, not a criminal gang, a legal one. It was called a tithing, and the broader system was called frank pledge, and it worked like this. Every male over the age of 12, more or less, was placed into a group of about 10 men, and those 10 men were collectively responsible for each other's behaviour. They swore to it. They stood surety for one another, which meant this. If one of your 10 committed a crime, the other 9 were legally obliged to produce him in court, to find him and bring him and hand him over. And if they failed to do that, if he ran and they could not or would not deliver him, then the whole tithing was punished, all 9 of them, fined, usually, made to pay for the crime of the man they had failed to bring in. Sit with that for a moment. From the thief's point of view, lying there in the dark, it means that the 9 men most likely to know where you are hiding, the 9 men who know your habits and your family, and the barn you always slept in as a boy, those 9 men have a direct and painful financial interest in finding you and handing you over. Your friends, your neighbours, your own tithing. The system had, quite deliberately, made your closest associates into your most motivated hunters, because if they do not catch you, they pay for what you did. There was no honour among thieves in that world, because the system had made honour among thieves financially ruinous, and the tithings sat inside larger units, hundreds, which were groups of about 10 tithings, and the whole thing was reviewed regularly at a court where every man had to confirm he was in a tithing and had kept his oath. It was a pyramid of mutual responsibility that covered the entire country and reached down to every single man in it, and it meant that everybody, everywhere, all the time, had a personal stake in everybody else behaving. So now consider our thief's position properly. He has stolen something in a village where everyone knows him. The hue and cry has gone up, and the entire population is chasing him. And behind that, 9 men who know him better than anyone are being told that they will pay his fine if they do not find him first. Where exactly is he supposed to go? Let those 9 men, sworn to one another, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange and precise arithmetic of medieval theft, and to the 12 pennies that stood between a man and the gallows. Now let us say the worst has happened and he has been caught, and we come to the law itself, and to a number that mattered more than almost any other number in medieval England, 12 pence. Because medieval English law drew a hard line through the middle of theft, and the line was drawn at value. If you stole goods worth less than 12 pence, that was petty larceny, a lesser crime, dealt with by lesser punishments, humiliating and unpleasant but survivable. If you stole goods worth 12 pence or more, that was grand larceny, and grand larceny was a felony, and the punishment for felony was death. 12 pence. That was the line. On one side of it, a beating or a fine or a spell in the stocks with the village watching. On the other side, the gallows. And I want you to feel how brutally arbitrary that is, and also how strangely modern, because we still do this. We still draw lines in law based on value, and the person on the wrong side of the line by a small amount suffers enormously more than the person on the right side of it. We just do not usually do it with someone's life. But here is the thing that makes this number so interesting, and it is the beginning of a theme that is going to run all the way through tonight and end up somewhere rather warm, because that number, 12 pence, was not just a rule that trapped people, it was also, in the hands of ordinary people, a door. Because who decided what the stolen goods were worth? The jury did. Local men, neighbours, people who knew the accused, who had known him all his life, who knew his mother, who knew he had 3 children and a bad year behind him. They were the ones who put a value on the stolen cloth or the stolen sheep. And the historical record shows that juries had a distinct and noticeable tendency to look at goods that were obviously worth rather more than 12 pence, and to consider them carefully, and to declare, with straight faces, that in their considered opinion, those goods were worth 11 pence. 11 pence. Just under. Every time. Again and again. They were not stupid, and neither was anyone else in the courtroom, and everybody knew exactly what was happening. It was a quiet, collective, entirely unofficial conspiracy of mercy, running underneath the harsh letter of the law, in which ordinary people used the one power they had, the power to set a value, to keep their neighbours from being hanged for stealing something they probably needed. The law said death, the village said 11 pence. Let that quiet mercy, hidden inside an arithmetic, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the problem the thief faced, even if he was never caught at all, which is that stolen goods in that world were almost impossible to get rid of. Suppose our thief gets away. Suppose he outruns the hue and cry, evades his tithing, vanishes into the woods with his prize. He has a problem, and it is a fatal one, and it is one that almost no one thinks about when they imagine medieval crime. He cannot sell it, because think about what he has stolen. In a world where almost everything was made by hand, locally, one at a time, every single object was individual. Your neighbour's cloak was not one of 10,000 identical cloaks from a factory. It was a specific cloak, made by a specific person, mended in a specific place with a specific patch, worn to a specific shape by a specific body over many years. Everyone who knew that person knew that cloak. The same was true of a pot, a knife, a bowl, a horse, a cow, a sheep. Objects in that world were as recognizable as faces. So the thief is now in possession of an object that shouts its owner's name at anyone who looks at it, and he has to convert it into something useful, which means selling it, which means showing it to people. And there was nowhere to do that. There was no anonymous marketplace. Markets were held in the open, in daylight, in specific places on specific days, watched by officials whose actual job was to keep an eye on what was being traded. Everyone at that market was local, or nearly. Strangers stood out enormously. And if you were a strange man trying to sell a very fine cloak that looked remarkably like the one that was stolen from the miller's wife over in the next village last Tuesday, then you were in a great deal of trouble very quickly indeed. There were no pawn shops in our sense. There was no fence in most places, no established underworld network to move goods through. Not in a village world. That kind of criminal infrastructure needs a city, needs anonymity, needs scale, and most of England was not cities. Most of England was small places where everyone watched everything. So the medieval village thief was left with a miserable set of options. Keep the thing and be caught with it, which was the worst possible position, because being caught in possession was nearly conclusive. Or destroy it, which gains you nothing at all, or try to sell it, and expose yourself in the one setting most likely to get you recognized. Which is why so much medieval theft, when you look at the actual court records, is not the daring larceny of stories. It is desperately practical. Food, grain, a hen, firewood, small amounts of cloth, things you can eat or burn or wear immediately, which disappear the moment they are used and cannot be traced. It is, overwhelmingly, the theft of people who were hungry and cold, taking things that would be gone by morning. And there is something sad in that, and worth remembering as we go on tonight. The medieval underworld of our imagination, with its master thieves and its clever heists, mostly did not exist out in the villages. What existed was hunger, and a hen going missing, and a whole legal apparatus of terrifying weight coming down on somebody who had taken a loaf. Let those unsellable stolen goods settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the one place in that whole world where a thief actually stood a chance, which was a town on market day. Everything I have told you so far applies to the village, and the village was where most people lived. But there was one environment in the medieval world where the thief's fundamental problem dissolved, and where a genuine criminal trade could and did exist, and that was the crowd. Towns were different. A decent-sized medieval town had thousands of people in it, and crucially, it had people passing through, traders and travellers and carters and pilgrims, faces nobody knew and would never see again. And on market days and at the great fairs, the population could swell enormously, packing the streets with strangers from every direction, all of them jostling together, all of them distracted, and many of them carrying money. And there, at last, our thief has the one thing he has been missing all evening: anonymity. In that crush, nobody knows him. Nobody can say afterward that they recognized his face. He can do a thing and simply walk away into a river of people, and there is no chase, because nobody knows who to chase. So the crowd is where medieval crime became professional. This is where you find the cut purse, and the name is exactly literal, because there were no pockets sewn into garments in the way you know them, and people carried their money in a purse hung from the belt, which meant that the theft was not a matter of slipping a hand in unnoticed. It was a matter of cutting the strings with a small sharp blade and walking away with the whole thing before the weight was missed. It was skilled work, and it was quick, and it was done in tight crowds where the pressing of bodies covered the movement. And where there are cut purses, there is a trade, and the trade develops the things trades develop. Partners, to distract and to jostle, and to take the purse away immediately so that the cutter is not found holding it. Knowledge of which fairs were worth attending and when. A network for moving stolen goods that a village simply could not sustain, because a town has enough transactions and enough strangers to hide a dishonest one. Pilgrimage sites were particularly rich ground, and there is a certain dark comedy in that. Enormous numbers of people from all over gathered in one place, in a state of religious excitement, distracted, carrying the money they had brought for their journey, and not one of them knowing a single local face. It is difficult to design a better environment for a purse cutter, and they went where the pilgrims went. So the picture we have of the medieval criminal underworld is not wrong, it is just displaced. It did not exist out in the fields, where everyone knew everyone, and a stolen hen was a village scandal. It existed in the crowd, in the town, at the fair, on the pilgrim road, in exactly the places where a person could be nobody for an afternoon. Let that jostling crowd, and the small sharp knife in it, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the roads between all those places, which were the most dangerous ground of all. Between the villages and the towns lay the roads, and the roads were where a traveller was most alone and most at risk, and where a different sort of criminal waited. Think about what a medieval road actually was. Not the smooth, engineered thing you picture, often a track, muddy or rutted, running between fields and then, for long stretches, through woodland and waste and empty country where there was nobody at all for a great distance in any direction. And on that road, a traveller walking or riding alone, carrying whatever they owned, hours from the nearest village, entirely beyond the reach of the hue and cry, because the hue and cry needs people within earshot, and there is nobody within earshot at all. That is where robbery happened, not the quiet theft of a hen in the night, but the direct and frightening kind, the demand on the road, and it was a genuine and well-understood danger of travel, which is why people travelled together whenever they possibly could, in groups, in convoys, joining up with whoever else was going the same way. That is what a pilgrim band is, in practical terms, underneath the piety. Safety in numbers on a dangerous road. Chaucer's pilgrims are riding together to Canterbury and telling each other stories, and the storytelling is the charm of it, but the riding together is the sense of it, and the authorities knew perfectly well where the danger lay, which produced one of my favourite pieces of practical medieval lawmaking. The Statute of Winchester, the same statute of 1285 that tightened up the hue and cry, contained a provision about the roads themselves. It required that the undergrowth and bushes be cleared back from the sides of the king's highways for a considerable distance, so that there would be no cover close to the road for anyone lying in wait. I find that genuinely clever and very human. They could not put a constable on every mile of road, so instead they cut back the bushes and turned the ambush into a much harder proposition, and made the traveller able to see danger coming from a long way off. It is crime prevention by landscaping in the 13th century, and it is the same logic as lighting a car park properly. So the medieval traveller moved through a world of calculated risk. Go in company, go in daylight, stay on the highway where the bushes have been cut, reach the next town before dark, and underneath all of it the knowledge that once you are out there between places, you are on your own in a way that a village person almost never was. and that the whole magnificent machinery of communal justice we have been describing simply cannot hear you. Let those long, empty roads settle gently in the dark. We turn now to how they decided guilt in an age before any evidence could really be gathered, and to the strangest trial in history. For a long stretch of the early medieval period, when a court could not decide whether someone was guilty, they handed the question over to God. It was called trial by ordeal, and it worked on a logic that is completely alien to us and made perfect sense to them. If human beings could not know the truth, then God could, and God, being just, would not permit an innocent person to suffer. So you put the accused into a situation where only a miracle could save them, and then you watched to see whether the miracle happened. There were several forms. There was ordeal by hot iron, where the accused carried a piece of heated metal a set number of paces, and their hand was then bound up and inspected some days later, and if the wound was healing cleanly, they were innocent, and if it was festering, they were guilty. There was ordeal by water, where the accused was lowered into a pool, and, in the version that has become famous, floating was taken as a sign of guilt and sinking as a sign of innocence, on the reasoning that the blessed water would receive an innocent person and reject a guilty one. There were others besides. Now, I am not going to dwell on this because it is grim and because you are trying to sleep, but I do want to say two honest things about it. The first is that it was not quite as mad as it sounds, in one specific and rather cynical sense. The ordeal was administered by the church in a highly ritualized setting, and the people running it had a great deal of discretion about how it was conducted and how the results were read. A wound is healing cleanly or it is not, and somebody has to look at it and decide. There is reason to think that the ordeal often functioned less as a genuine trial by miracle and more as an enormous piece of psychological pressure, and that the priests administering it had a fair amount of room to arrive at the answer the community already believed was true. It was frightening enough that a genuinely guilty person might well confess rather than face it, which may have been rather the point. The second thing is that it ended. In 1215, the Church, at the Fourth Lateran Council, forbade clergy from taking part in ordeals, and without a priest to bless it and interpret it, the ordeal simply collapsed, because the whole thing rested on the presence of God's representative. Within a generation it was essentially gone, which left England with an enormous problem. If God was no longer going to decide these cases, then who was? And the answer they arrived at is the answer we still use. They turned to 12 ordinary men. Let that strange old trial, and the day it ended, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to what replaced it, which is a thing you would recognize instantly, sitting in a room, being asked to judge your neighbour. So the jury came in, and grew, and became the ordinary way that guilt was decided in England, and it is a direct ancestor of the jury system that still runs today in a great many countries. But the medieval jury was not the jury you are imagining, and the difference matters enormously for our thief. The jury you imagine is composed of strangers, selected precisely because they know nothing whatsoever about the case or the accused, who must have everything explained to them from scratch, and who decide purely on the evidence presented in the room. That is the modern ideal, and the whole design is aimed at impartiality. The medieval jury was the opposite. It was composed of local men who were expected to know. They were drawn from the neighbourhood precisely because they were familiar with the people and the events. They were not blank slates to be filled with evidence. They were the community's memory and the community's judgment, brought into a room and asked to speak. They knew the accused. They knew the victim. They knew what everyone had been saying about it in the alehouse for the last 3 weeks. They came in already possessing the local truth of the matter, and their verdict was, in large part, the village's collective opinion given legal force. And that cuts both ways, and this is what makes it so interesting. If the village thought you were a bad lot, if you had a reputation, if you were the sort who was always in trouble, then you were in terrible danger, because 12 men who had disliked you since childhood were about to decide your fate, and no amount of clever argument was going to shift what they already knew about you in their bones. But if the village thought you were a decent person who had done a foolish thing, or a desperate one, or if they simply did not want to see you hanged, then those same 12 men had an extraordinary amount of quiet power to save you, and they used it. They used it constantly. That is what the elevenpence was. That is what a great deal of medieval justice actually was, underneath the terrifying formal structure. It was a community deciding, case by case, face by face, who it was willing to give up, and who it was going to protect. The law was rigid and merciless. The people administering it, at the ground level, were neither, and the space between those two facts is where an enormous number of medieval lives were quietly saved. Let those 12 knowing neighbours settle gently in the dark. We turn now to an older method still, in which your defence was not evidence at all, but the number of people willing to swear that you were the sort of person who would not do such a thing. Before the jury settled into the shape we know, and alongside it for a long time, there was another way of resolving an accusation, and it is one of the most revealing things about that whole society, because it tells you exactly what they thought truth was made of. It was called compurgation, or wager of law, and it worked like this. The accused swore a solemn oath that he was innocent, and then he produced a number of other people, often 12, sometimes more, sometimes fewer depending on the seriousness of the matter, and each of them swore an oath too. But here is the crucial thing, and it is what makes it so strange to modern ears. Those people were not witnesses. They were not there to say what they had seen. Most of them had seen nothing at all, and everyone understood that. They were called oath helpers, and what they swore to was not the facts of the case. What they swore to was the man. They swore that his oath was clean, that he was the kind of person whose word could be trusted, that when he said he did not do it, that statement was worth believing, and if he could produce enough of them, of sufficient standing, and if everyone got the wording exactly right, which mattered enormously, then he was cleared. Now, that sounds absurd to us, and it is easy to sneer at it, but think about what it actually is, and it becomes rather sharp. It is a system in which your defense is your reputation, made countable. It converts the community's collective opinion of your character into a number, and then it lets that number decide. And in the world we have been describing all night, that is not nearly as mad as it looks. Remember where we are. Everybody knows everybody, and has done for generations. The community's opinion of you is not a vague thing. It is a dense and detailed and extremely well-informed body of knowledge, built up over your entire life. And there is very little other evidence available. No forensics, no records, no way to establish most facts at all. So you use the one enormous store of information that genuinely does exist, which is what your neighbours know about you. And it had real teeth, because the oath was taken seriously, in a world that believed absolutely that a false oath imperiled your soul. You were not asking 12 men to tell a small lie for you. You were asking them to risk damnation for you, publicly, which meant the man with no friends, the man with a bad name, the man everyone had privately decided was a wrong sort, could not find his 12 and had no defence at all. So it was fair in one direction and merciless in the other. If you had lived decently among people who knew you, you had a shield made of your own past behaviour, and if you had not, you had nothing. Let those 12 men swearing for a neighbour settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strangest survival of all, in which two people settled a legal dispute by fighting each other in a field. The Normans brought with them another method of letting God decide, and it is the one everybody has heard of, and it is exactly what it sounds like: trial by battle. If two parties were in dispute, in certain kinds of case, they could settle it by fighting, on the same theological reasoning as the ordeal, which was that God would grant victory to the party in the right. It was never the everyday method, and it was hedged about with rules and restrictions, and applied only to particular sorts of case, and it declined steadily through the medieval period. But it existed, and it was used, and some of the details of it are extraordinary, because certain people could not reasonably be expected to fight. Women, the elderly, the sick, the clergy, citizens of some towns that had negotiated exemptions, and so the system permitted champions. You could hire a man to fight on your behalf, and a professional class of champions duly appeared, men who fought other people's legal battles for money, which is a phrase we still use to mean an advocate, and which started out meaning exactly what it says. And so you get the wonderful image of two hired professionals hammering at each other with staves in a marked-off field, watched by the actual parties to the dispute, who are standing at the side in perfectly good health, waiting to find out who owns a piece of land, while God, in theory, decides. The fight was not usually to the death in civil matters, and often ran until one side yielded, or until the daylight failed, and yielding cost you the case. And it faded, as the ordeal faded, as juries took over, and as the whole idea of asking heaven to referee a property dispute came to seem less obviously sensible. But here is the delightful footnote, and it is completely true. The right to trial by battle was never formally abolished in England for a very long time indeed. It simply fell out of use, and lay there, unrepealed, quietly on the books. And in the early 19th century, a defendant in a criminal case, well advised by a clever lawyer, actually demanded it, and to general astonishment, the court had to concede that the old right still technically stood. Parliament abolished it the following year, in some embarrassment. So the last successful invocation of trial by combat in England happened not in the age of knights, but in the age of steam engines, because nobody had remembered to tidy up the law. Let those two champions in a field settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the court, where almost all ordinary people actually met the law, which was far smaller and far more concerned with pigs. We have spent a good deal of tonight on felonies and gallows and outlawry, and I have given you a slightly misleading impression, so let me correct it, because the actual legal experience of the average medieval person was nothing like that at all. Most people's encounter with the law happened at the manor court, which met regularly in the village, and which dealt with the ordinary friction of people living close together. And the surviving records of these courts are one of the great pleasures of medieval history, because they are so completely, gloriously mundane. Here is the sort of thing that fills them. Somebody's pigs got into somebody else's crop, and there is a fine. Somebody moved a boundary marker between strips of land, and there is an argument about it that has clearly been running for 2 years. Somebody's cart was left where it blocked the lane. Somebody let a ditch fall into disrepair, and the water backed up onto a neighbour's ground. Somebody brewed and sold ale that was not up to standard, and was fined, and it is worth saying that these ale fines appear so regularly and so predictably that historians generally read them less as punishment and more as a routine licensing charge that everybody simply expected to pay. Somebody called somebody else a name in public, and it was serious enough to bring to court, because in a world where reputation was everything, defamation was not a trivial matter at all. There are disputes about inheritance, disputes about who owes what labour, disputes about a hedge, endless disputes about animals, because animals wander and crops are food and food is survival. And what you see, reading them, is not a terrifying machine of medieval justice. You see a village managing itself. You see the same names coming up again and again over decades, the same families arguing with the same families, grievances passing from one generation to the next, small sums changing hands, order being maintained, not by terror, but by the constant patient grinding of neighbours holding each other to account about fences. That was the law, for almost everyone, almost all the time, not the gallows. a room full of people arguing about a pig. And it is worth holding on to, because it is the necessary corrective to everything else tonight, and because it is quietly reassuring at this hour. The dramatic apparatus existed. It was real, and it was harsh. But underneath it, and vastly more common, was this: ordinary people with ordinary complaints, sorting out ordinary trouble, in a village, in the afternoon, and then going home for supper. Let that court full of pigs and ditches and hedges settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the most remarkable escape route of all, the one that ran straight through the door of a church. Here is one of the strangest and most wonderful rules in all of medieval law, and it has given us a word we still use. If you were accused of a crime, and you could get yourself inside a church, you could not be touched. That was sanctuary. Any church, chapel, churchyard or cemetery in England would do. Get through the door, and the arm of the law stopped at the threshold, because you were now standing on holy ground and under the protection of God, and the sheriff and the whole hue and cry could stand outside and shout themselves hoarse, and could not lawfully lay a finger on you. And you had 40 days of being fed, more or less, by a community that was legally responsible for keeping you alive in there, and often deeply resentful about it. 40 days of sitting in a cold stone building, with the entire village outside, knowing exactly where you were, waiting. 40 days to think about your two options, because at the end of the 40 days you had to choose one of them. Option 1 was to come out and stand trial and take your chances with those 12 neighbours. Option 2 was extraordinary. You could confess your crime to the coroner and abjure the realm, which meant to swear a solemn oath that you would leave England forever and never return, on pain of death. And if you took that option, something remarkable happened. They let you go. Let that quiet stone refuge settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the strange, sad journey of the man who chose exile, walking to the sea in a straight line. The abjurer's journey is one of the eeriest images in medieval England, and I have never been able to forget it since I first read about it. If you chose to abjure the realm, you confessed before the coroner, and you swore your oath, and then you were given a destination, a port, and a route, and a number of days in which to reach it. And you were sent out of the church, and you walked in a very particular way. In the traditional form of it, the abjurer was to carry a wooden cross in his hands, and to keep to the king's highway, and never to leave the road, not for any reason, not to sleep anywhere else, not to wander, not to stray, bareheaded, sometimes barefoot, holding his cross, walking the road to the coast, in a straight line, through the middle of a country that had cast him out. And everyone who saw him coming knew exactly what he was. The cross in his hands said it. Here comes a man who has confessed a felony and is walking out of England forever. Villages he passed through would have watched him go by in silence. He could not stop. He could not step off the road. If he did, he lost his protection, and any man could take him. And at the end of the road was a port, and at the port he had to take the first available ship, and if there was no ship he was required to walk into the sea up to his knees each day as a sign that he was trying to leave, and wait, and try again the next day until a ship came, and then he was gone, out of England, forever, into a foreign country where he did not speak the language, and knew no one, and had nothing, cast out of the only world he had ever known, but alive. There is something almost unbearably lonely in that picture. The man on the road with the wooden cross, walking east or south toward a sea he has probably never seen, past fields that look like his fields, and villages that look like his village, and no one will speak to him, and he cannot stop, and he is never coming back. But he is alive. That is the thing to hold on to. That road was mercy, of a hard and strange kind. It was the medieval world's way of saying that even a confessed felon was a soul, and that God's house would not give him up to be killed, and that there had to be some door out that was not the gallows. So they built one, and it led to the sea. Let that lonely road, and the man walking it with his cross, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a verse from a psalm, and to the most peculiar loophole in the history of English law. This one is my favourite thing in the entire history of medieval justice, and it is so absurd that it sounds invented, and it is entirely real, and it saved a very large number of lives. It began sensibly enough. The Church claimed the right to try its own people in its own courts. If you were a clergyman, and you were accused of a crime, you did not go before the king's judges. You went before a church court, which was gentler, more interested in penance than punishment, and which crucially did not hand down death sentences. This was called benefit of clergy, and it caused enormous friction between kings and archbishops, and it is a large part of what Henry II and Thomas Becket fell out over. But it raised an obvious practical question: how do you prove that somebody is a clergyman? And the answer they landed on was this: clergy could read. Almost nobody else could. So the test for being a clergyman became a reading test. Hand the accused a Bible, ask him to read a passage, and if he can, he is clergy, and off he goes to the gentler court. And the passage was always the same one. It was Psalm 51, the opening of it, the great plea for mercy, which begins, in Latin, Miserere me Deus, have mercy on me, O God. Now, if the test is always the same passage, and your life depends on passing it, what do? You memorize it. Of course you do. You cannot read a word, you have never read a word in your life, but you learn that one piece of Latin by heart, letter perfect, and you hold it in your head your whole life like a key sewn into your coat. And when they hand you the book, you stare at the page and you recite it, and you walk out of that courtroom alive. They called it the neck verse, because it saved your neck. And everyone knew. That is the beautiful part. The judges knew perfectly well that half the men reciting that psalm could not read the page in front of them. The whole legal establishment knew, and the loophole stayed open anyway, for centuries, and was eventually written into statute in 1351 under Edward III to cover anyone who could read, and it became one of the great quiet mercy mechanisms of English law, a way of letting a first offender off the ultimate punishment without ever having to admit that was what you were doing. Have mercy on me, O God. Recited in a language he did not speak, from a page he could not read, by a frightened man who had learned it as a child in case he ever needed it. I think that is one of the most human things I have ever come across. Let that memorized psalm settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the fate of those who ran and kept running, and to what it meant to be declared a wolf. And what if he simply ran? What if he did not go to a church, and was never caught, and simply vanished into the woods and did not come back? Then eventually, after he had failed to appear in court enough times, the law gave up on catching him and did something else instead. It declared him an outlaw. An outlaw is another word we have completely defanged. To us it sounds romantic, a dashing figure on a horse. In its original legal meaning, it was one of the most frightening things that could happen to a person, and it meant something very precise. It meant you were placed outside the law, not outside in the sense of breaking it, outside in the sense of no longer being protected by it. The law was a shelter, and you were now standing outside the shelter, and everything the law did for ordinary people, it no longer did for you. You could not own property, because property is a legal idea. You could not bring a case, or seek justice, or claim protection of any kind, because the whole apparatus that gave those things had formally stopped applying to you. You had, in a legal sense, ceased to be a person. And in the older and harsher form of it, an outlaw could be killed by anyone, without penalty, and there was a phrase for it that has stayed with me ever since I learned it. They said that an outlaw bore the wolf's head, caput lupinum. He was to be treated as a wolf is treated, as vermin, as something that anybody might lawfully destroy on sight. By the later Middle Ages, this had been softened considerably. and outlaws were generally supposed to be brought in rather than simply killed, and many outlaws were eventually pardoned, and outlawry became more a procedural pressure to make people turn up in court than a literal death sentence. But the shape of the idea remained, and it tells you what that society believed at bottom, which was that the law was not a burden imposed on you, but a shelter you lived inside, and that the worst punishment imaginable was not pain, but exclusion, to be put outside, to be no longer one of us. And this is where Robin Hood comes from, of course, and all the Greenwood stories, the outlaw in the forest living free beyond the reach of a corrupt authority. But the reality was mostly not romantic at all. It was a man in the woods, in winter, with no property and no rights and no protection, unable to go home, unable to go to a market, unable to ask anyone for anything, hunted and cold and hungry and alone. The Greenwood was not a kingdom of liberty. It was where you went when there was nowhere else, and most of the people out there were not merry. Let that word outlaw, and the loneliness underneath the romance, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the nearest thing that world had to a policeman, who was your neighbour, and who had not asked for the job. I have said several times tonight that there were no police, and that is true, but it is not quite the whole picture, because there were officials, and the position they occupied was a peculiar one. At the top of the county there was the sheriff, the king's man, responsible for a great deal including the keeping of the peace, and he had real power, and he could raise the whole armed body of the county to pursue a serious criminal, which was called the posse comitatus, and which is where the American word posse comes from. So there was authority, and at the higher levels it was professional and it was formidable. But down at the level of the village and the town ward, where nearly everything actually happened, the man responsible was the constable, and the constable was not a professional anything. He was a local man, appointed for a year, usually unpaid, chosen by his neighbours or by the manor court, and expected to carry out his duties on top of his own work and his own farming and his own life. And a great many of them, understandably, did not want the job at all. It was troublesome, and it made you unpopular. Your duties involved raising the hue and cry, and arresting people, and keeping the peace, and reporting offences, and all of that meant acting against people you had known your entire life, and would have to keep living beside for the rest of it. There are records of men paying fines rather than serve, and of communities having to compel people to take their turn. Then there was the watch, which was the town's nighttime arrangement, ordinary householders taking turns to stand watch and patrol the streets after dark, again as an unpaid duty. The Statute of Winchester regulated this too, requiring towns to keep watch through the night and to shut their gates, and requiring the watchman to arrest strangers moving about at odd hours. It was, once again, a system built entirely out of ordinary people taking turns. So the enforcement of law in that world was not a force standing apart from the community. It was the community itself, rostered. And that has two consequences, and you can feel both of them running through everything else tonight. It made the system enormously powerful, because it could mobilize everybody. And it made the system enormously merciful, because the person doing the enforcing was your neighbour, who had to see you at church on Sunday, and who might just decide, quietly, not to have noticed. Let that reluctant neighbour with a year of duty settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the medieval prison, and to the surprising fact that it was almost never a punishment. Here is something that changes the whole shape of medieval justice once you understand it, and almost nobody does. They did not really do prison sentences. We think of prison as the normal punishment for crime. You are convicted, you are sentenced to a period of time, you serve it, that is the punishment. That whole idea, the deprivation of years of a person's life as a measured penalty, is essentially a modern invention. It is not how the medieval world worked at all. Medieval gaols existed, and they were often dreadful places. but their function was mostly custodial rather than punitive. You were held in gaol while waiting for the court to sit, which could be a long and miserable wait, since the travelling justices might only come a few times a year. You were held for debt until you paid. You were held awaiting the outcome of something, but the sentence itself, when it came, was almost never a term of imprisonment. And the reason is straightforwardly economic. Prison is enormously expensive. It requires a building and guards and food for people who are producing nothing, day after day, for years, at somebody's cost. A medieval community had absolutely no interest in feeding an able-bodied man for 5 years to punish him for stealing a sheep. It was an unthinkable waste of resources. So punishment took forms that were cheap and quick and immediate, and this is the key to the whole thing. Fines, which cost nothing to administer and brought money in. Physical punishments, which were over in an afternoon. Public shaming, which required only a wooden frame and an audience. And at the top end, for felony, execution, which was final and cost nothing to maintain. That is why the medieval system looks so brutal to us. It was not that they were more cruel than we are, exactly. It is that they had not invented, and could not have afforded, the specific alternative that we now use instead. When you cannot warehouse people, and you still want to punish them, what is left is money, pain, shame, and death. And when you see it that way, the terrible severity of medieval justice becomes less a statement about their moral character and more a statement about their material poverty. Prison is a luxury of a rich society. They were not rich. Let that empty gale settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the wooden frame in the market square and to the punishment that worked entirely by being watched. In the market square of a great many medieval towns and villages, there stood a simple wooden frame, and it is probably the single most recognizable image of medieval punishment, and it is worth understanding what it was actually for, because it is not what it looks like. The stocks held you by the ankles, seated on the ground. The pillory held you by the neck and wrists, standing. Both were public. Both were placed deliberately in the busiest spot in the settlement, and both were used for lesser offences: the petty theft under 12 pence, the dishonest trader, the drunk and disorderly, the seller of bad ale or short weight. And the physical discomfort was real, but it was not the point. You could sit in the stocks for a few hours and be perfectly intact at the end of it. The point was the audience. Because in the world we have been describing all night, where everyone knows you and your family, and your reputation is the most valuable thing you own, being displayed in the middle of the market for an afternoon while every single person you know walks past and looks at you, is a devastating punishment. It is the destruction of your standing among people you cannot escape and will live among forever. Your children see it, your neighbours see it, the people you will need to borrow from next winter see it. And unlike a fine, which is over when it is paid, this becomes part of what everybody knows about you, permanently. That is the punishment, not the wood, the eyes. It is precisely calibrated to a society of total mutual knowledge, and it would be almost meaningless in ours. Put a stranger in stocks in a modern city, and thousands of people would walk past who have no idea who they are, will never see them again, and whose opinion costs the person nothing. The punishment only works if the audience is your whole world. And that is, when you think about it, an uncomfortable thought to arrive at, because our own age has quietly reinvented exactly this. We have built, without particularly meaning to, a machine for public shaming at enormous scale, in which an ordinary person can be displayed before an audience far larger than any medieval market square, for an offence often far smaller, with no fixed term and no formal end, and no possibility of ever quite stepping down off the platform and going home. The medieval stocks, at least, let you out at sundown. Let that wooden frame in the square settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the King's Forest, and to a whole category of crime invented purely so that a man in a castle could hunt deer. If you want a really pure example of how the law can be used to take something from ordinary people and give it to a very small number of powerful ones, the medieval forest law is about as clean an illustration as history offers. Large parts of England were designated as royal forest, and forest, in this legal sense, does not necessarily mean trees. It was a legal designation, an area placed under a special set of laws, the forest law, which existed for one purpose, which was to preserve the hunting of the king and those he permitted. And inside a royal forest, an enormous number of perfectly ordinary activities that people had done for generations became crimes. Taking deer, obviously, which was the great offence, but also cutting wood, clearing land to farm, grazing your animals in the wrong place at the wrong time, owning a dog that had not been lawed, which meant having its claws cut so it could not chase game. All ordinary things, all necessary things for people living on that land, all now offences against a set of laws that had been laid over their homes without their asking. And the punishments under forest law were severe, notoriously so, and in the harshest periods could be dreadful indeed for taking a deer. Later they were softened, and fines became more usual than the terrible physical penalties of the earliest years. But the essential injustice remained, which was that a hungry man could look at a forest full of meat, on land his family had lived beside forever, and know that touching any of it could destroy him, because the animals belonged to a man he would never meet. The whole thing was so resented that it became one of the great political grievances of the age. There is a companion document to Magna Carta, the Charter of the Forest, which dealt specifically with these complaints and rolled back some of the worst of it and restored certain rights of common people to the forests. It is less famous than Magna Carta, and in some ways it did more for ordinary lives, because it was about firewood and pasture and the right to feed your pigs, which is what most people actually needed. But the deer stayed the king's, and the poacher, in the popular imagination, and in a good deal of reality, became a different kind of criminal from the thief, one that ordinary people did not much disapprove of, because everyone understood perfectly well that taking a deer to feed your family was not the same as robbing your neighbour, whatever the law said. Let that forest full of meat that belonged to a stranger settle gently in the dark. We turn now away from the thief entirely to all the other people in that world who had drawn a terrible lot in life, beginning with the man who had the worst job of all. Every town in the medieval world produced an enormous quantity of human waste, and it had to go somewhere, and somebody had to move it. And that somebody was the gong farmer. That was the actual name of the actual job. Gong was an old word for privy, and for what was in it, and the gong farmer's work was to empty the cesspits and the privies of the town. He climbed down into them at night, because he was generally forbidden to work during the day, for obvious reasons, and he dug the contents out by hand and by bucket, and he carted it away beyond the walls. It was, without much competition, the worst job available to a human being in that world. It was disgusting, in a way that is hard to overstate. It was dangerous, genuinely dangerous, because a cesspit generates gases that can overcome a person, and there are records of gong farmers dying in the pits they were emptying, suffocated in the dark. And it carried a social stigma so total that gong farmers were often required to live apart, at the edges of towns, and were restricted in where they could go and when. And here is the thing that always strikes me about it. It was well paid. Comparatively, remarkably well paid, sometimes several times what an ordinary labourer earned, because the work was so vile that you could not get anybody to do it otherwise. So the gong farmer occupied this strange position of being simultaneously one of the better paid working men in the town and the single most socially excluded, a man with money in his pocket who nobody would sit next to. And somebody did it. That is what I want you to hold as you drift. Every town, every generation, Some man got up in the evening and went out and did that work, all night, in the dark and the stink, so that the town he lived in would not drown in its own filth, and everyone he did it for despised him for doing it, and he went home in the morning and slept while the town he had cleaned went about its day. Nobody thanked him. Nobody has ever thanked him, and I am not going to pretend that saying so now makes any difference to a man who has been dead for 600 years. But it does no harm at all, lying here in the warm dark, to spare a thought for the medieval gong farmer, who had the worst job in the world and did it anyway. Let that unthanked labour, done in the dark, settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man whose job was worse in a different way, and who was needed by everyone and welcomed by no one. I will handle this one carefully, because of what the job was, and I am not going to describe any of the work. But the executioner belongs in tonight's company, because his lot was genuinely one of the strangest and loneliest in that world, and it is not what people expect, because we imagine the medieval executioner as a figure of menace, hooded and cruel, enjoying himself. The reality, as far as we can tell, was almost the opposite. It was a job, and it was a job that carried such a heavy stigma that it poisoned the entire life of the man who held it, and often the lives of his family too. In many places, the executioner and his household were socially excluded almost completely. He might be required to live outside the town walls, or in a particular house set apart. People would not drink with him, would not trade with him casually, would not sit near him in church, and in some regions there were formal rules about it, about which door he used, and where he stood, and what he could touch in the market. His children often found it very difficult to marry anyone outside similar families, with the result that in some parts of Europe, executioner families intermarried across generations, and the job became hereditary, passed from father to son, not because anybody wanted it, but because no other door was open to them. He was necessary. That is the bitter core of it. The society had decided that these punishments would happen, and if they were going to happen, then somebody had to carry them out, and everybody knew it. He was doing the community's own will, on the community's own instruction, and the community's response to the man who did the thing they had ordered was to shun him and his children and his children's children. There is a moral cowardice in that which is very old and very recognizable, and it did not end in the Middle Ages. We are still capable of demanding that something be done and then despising whoever does it. And there was one more strange thing about him, which I find genuinely poignant, because the executioner, uniquely, had detailed practical knowledge of the human body. Many of them worked as informal healers on the side, and people came to them for it, quietly, at the back door, at night. The same neighbours who would not stand near him in daylight would come to him in the dark when their shoulder was dislocated or their child was ill, because he knew things nobody else knew, and then in the morning they would cross the street to avoid him again. Let that necessary and lonely man settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a whole trade that stank so badly that entire towns pushed it beyond the walls. If you wanted leather, and everyone wanted leather, because leather was shoes and belts and bags and harness and armour and 100 other necessary things, then somebody had to turn an animal's hide into it, and that process was one of the foulest industries in human history. I will spare you the full detail, but the essentials are these. The hide had to be cleaned of hair and flesh, which involved soaking it in unpleasant solutions. It had to be softened, and the traditional method for that involved substances I will not describe in any depth at this hour, but which came out of animals and were collected for the purpose and left to work on the skins in open pits for a long time in the warm. And then it had to be tanned proper, soaked for months in pits of water and crushed oak bark, which is where the name comes from. The result was leather, which everyone needed. The process was a stench so monumental that it was one of the very few things medieval towns, which were not squeamish places, actively legislated against. Tanneries were pushed to the edges of towns, downwind, downstream, beyond the walls where possible, and the tanners with them. And so the tanner, like the gong farmer, lived a life shaped entirely by the smell of his own necessary trade. He could not get it off himself. It was in his clothes and his hair and his hands, permanently, and everyone knew what he was the moment he came near. He was pushed to the margins of the town physically, and to the margins of society socially, and he made shoes possible for everybody who looked down on him. There is a pattern forming tonight, and you may have noticed it. The people at the bottom of that world were very often the people doing the jobs that made the world function, the waste that had to be moved, the leather that everyone needed, the punishments the community had ordered. Somebody had to do all of it, and the reward for doing the necessary and unpleasant thing was, almost universally, to be despised for it by the people who benefited. That has not entirely stopped being true, and it is worth a moment's thought before we move on. Let that stinking necessary trade settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man who was probably innocent, and whom absolutely everybody suspected anyway. Here is a lighter one, and a genuinely funny one, and it is one of the most consistent prejudices in the entire medieval world. Everybody, everywhere, all the time, was completely convinced that the miller was stealing from them. The setup is this. You grow grain. You cannot eat grain as it is, so it must be ground into flour. Grinding is done at the mill, which is an expensive piece of machinery owned by the lord, and in many places you were legally obliged to use it, and forbidden to grind your own at home. And the miller took his payment, not in coin, but in a portion of the flour. So you hand over a sack of your grain to a man who takes some of it as his fee and gives you back the rest, and you have no practical way whatsoever of checking whether the portion he took was the portion he was entitled to. And so, universally, across the whole of Europe, for centuries, everybody assumed he was taking more. Millers appear in medieval literature and proverb and joke as a byword for dishonesty. Chaucer gives us a miller with a thumb of gold, which is a joke about the trick of pressing a thumb on the scale, and the joke lands because his audience already knew that all millers were thieves. There were sayings about how to tell an honest miller, most of which end with the answer being that you cannot, because there is no such thing. And here is the fun part. Some of them absolutely were stealing. Court records do turn up millers taking more than their share, and the temptation was obvious and constant. But there is no way on earth that every miller in Europe was a thief, and the vast majority were presumably just men doing a difficult technical job with a dangerous machine. They were suspected as a class, permanently, for structural reasons, because their job put them in a position where cheating was possible and undetectable, and that was quite enough. Which is a very human thing, and still recognizable. We do not suspect people because we have evidence. We suspect them because their position gives them an opportunity, and the suspicion attaches to the role rather than the person. And an honest man in a suspected job spends his whole life being disbelieved for things he never did. The medieval miller was probably, on the whole, more sinned against than sinning. He remains, 600 years later, the most reliably distrusted profession in the historical record. Let that suspected miller and his golden thumb settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man caught between the lord above him and the neighbours beside him, in what may be the most uncomfortable position in the village. The lord owned the manor, but the lord did not run it day to day. Somebody had to organise the work, see that the ploughing was done and the harvest brought in, keep the accounts, make sure everyone turned up for the labour they owed, and report to the lord's steward. And that man was the reeve. And here is the excruciating part. The reeve was, very often, chosen from among the peasants themselves. He was one of them. He was a villein like his neighbours, holding his own land, working his own strips, born in that village, and related to half of it, and he was elected or appointed to spend his year standing between his own people and the man who owned them. So imagine the position. It is harvest time, and the Lord's fields must be cut before anyone's own crop, that being the arrangement. And your neighbour, whose child is ill, and whose own barley is standing ready, and who has not slept in 3 days, does not come out to work. And your job, on behalf of a man in a hall who has never spoken to either of you, is to note it, and to report it, and to see him fined for it at the manor court, and then to go home and live next door to him for the rest of your life. The reeve had to be trusted by the Lord and endured by the village, which are two conditions that pull very hard in opposite directions. Push too hard and your own community turns cold on you, and you will feel it at every gathering and every harvest and every funeral for the next 40 years. Push too little, and the steward marks you as useless, or worse, as complicit, and you can be held personally answerable for shortfalls. And so the good reeve, one imagines, spent his year performing an exhausting balancing act, being just firm enough to satisfy above and just soft enough to be forgiven below, quietly not noticing certain things, quietly rounding certain numbers, getting the harvest in without destroying his own standing among the only people he would ever know. I have a good deal of sympathy for the medieval reeve. He is the ancestor of every middle manager who has ever lived, of everyone who has had to deliver a decision they did not make to people they have to face afterward, and he had to do it in a village of 200 people from which there was no escape whatsoever. Let that man in the middle settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man who lived entirely alone in the woods and came back black from head to foot. Iron cannot be worked without charcoal, and charcoal does not occur in nature, and so somebody had to make it, and the making of it was one of the strangest and most solitary lives in the medieval world. Charcoal is made by burning wood very slowly with almost no air, so that it does not turn to ash but to something that will later burn far hotter than wood ever could, which is what a smith needs. And the way you did it was to build a great mound of stacked wood, cover it entirely with turf and earth, light it from within, and then watch it, constantly, for days on end, because the whole thing is a controlled near suffocation, and if the covering breaks and air rushes in, the mound catches properly and you lose the entire burn, days of labour gone in an hour. So the charcoal burner could not leave. He stayed with the mound, day and night, sleeping in snatches beside it in a rough shelter of branches, waking to check it, patching the earth where it cracked, alone, deep in the woodland, sometimes for a week or more at a time. And then he came out of the trees, filthy, blackened from head to foot, smelling of smoke, having spoken to nobody for days, to sell what he had made. And the village looked at him rather sideways, as villages do. He lived out in the woods, which was where outlaws and wild things were. He was black as a devil. He kept his own company, and had strange skills, and knew the deep parts of the forest that ordinary people avoided. That is a recipe for exactly the sort of half-suspicion that attaches to anybody who lives at the edge of the settled world. And charcoal burners turn up in folklore across Europe as slightly uncanny figures, wild men of the woods, sometimes wise, sometimes to be avoided. He was, of course, simply a working man doing a technical job that the entire economy of ironworking depended on, and doing it in the only way it could be done, which happened to require solitude and soot. But I confess I find something almost enviable in the picture, at this hour. A man alone in a wood, in the dark, with a slow fire he must tend and nothing else in the world to do, watching a mound of earth breathe smoke for a week, with the trees all around and no other soul for miles. It sounds like the loneliest job in the world, and it also sounds, from a warm bed on a quiet night, oddly peaceful. Let that solitary fire in the woods settle gently in the dark. We turn now, briefly, to a handful of other trades that nobody wanted and everybody needed. There is a whole gallery of these, and I will run through a few of them gently, because each one adds to the picture we have been building of a world that ran on unpleasant necessary work done by people it did not respect. There was the fuller. Cloth, when it comes off the loom, is loose and greasy and must be thickened and cleaned, and the process was called fulling, and for a long time it was done by treading the cloth by foot in a trough, for hours, in a liquid that included stale urine, which was collected for the purpose and which worked because of the ammonia in it. The fuller stood in it and trod cloth all day, and then somebody wore the coat. There was the rat catcher, whose job was as unglamorous as it sounds, and who was needed constantly, and who moved between houses and barns doing a filthy necessary thing, with dogs and traps and whatever else worked. There was the swineherd and the shepherd, who were not despised exactly, but whose lives were solitary and cold to a degree we would find hard, out with the animals in all weather, sleeping rough with the flock at lambing, away from the warmth of the village for long stretches. There was the miner, wherever there was mining, working in conditions that do not bear describing at bedtime, underground, by candlelight, in wet and dark and danger, for wages that would not now buy a sandwich. And there was the ordinary labourer, the man with no land at all, who owned nothing but his own arms and hired them out day by day, whose work was uncertain and whose position was the most precarious of anybody's, because he had no strip of ground to fall back on when nobody wanted him that week. I run through them quickly not because they matter less, but because the pattern is by now completely clear, and it is the pattern I want to leave with you before we turn toward the end. Every single one of these people was doing something without which the pleasant parts of that world could not have existed. No fuller, no cloth, no charcoal burner, no iron, no gong farmer, no town at all, no labourer, no harvest. And the reward, almost without exception, was to occupy the bottom of a society that was quietly and entirely dependent on them. Let all those unwanted necessary trades settle gently in the dark. We turn now to something much harder and much sadder, which is what happened to people who had nothing at all. Now we come to the poorest, and to a genuine difference between the early medieval world and the world that came after it, and it is a difference that runs in a direction you might not expect. For much of the Middle Ages, to be poor and to beg was not a crime. It was a misfortune, and it was understood in a religious frame that gave it a kind of dignity. Christ had been poor. The poor had a claim on the charity of the better off, and giving alms was not merely kind but spiritually necessary for the giver, a way of storing up merit and doing what the faith required. Monasteries distributed food. Wealthy people left money in their wills for the poor of the parish. There was a whole structure of obligation, imperfect and patchy, and often grudging, but real, and inside it, a beggar was a person with a recognized place, someone whose need gave others the opportunity to do good. That is not a sentimental picture, and I am not going to pretend it was a golden age of compassion. Poverty was miserable and dangerous and often fatal, but the beggar at the church door was not a criminal, and the society had a story about him that made room for him. And then that changed, and it changed hard, and the change came with the Black Death and everything that followed it. The plague killed so many people that labour suddenly became scarce and valuable, and workers who survived found they could demand better wages, and the authorities responded with laws trying to force people to work for the old rates and stay where they were. And in that new world, a person wandering the roads without work began to look less like a soul in need and more like a labourer refusing to labour. And so, over the following centuries, the wandering poor were increasingly criminalised. Vagrancy became an offence. Laws were passed distinguishing the deserving poor, the old and the sick and the genuinely unable, from the sturdy beggar who was assumed to be idle by choice, and the punishments for the second category grew steadily harsher. The beggar had been transformed from an object of charity into a suspect. and the transformation was driven not by any change in the poor themselves, but by an economic shift and the interests of those who needed cheap labour. I find that a bleak and very instructive piece of history, and it is worth carrying gently, because the distinction between the deserving and undeserving poor did not come down from heaven. It was invented at a particular time, for particular reasons, by people who had an interest in inventing it, and it is still with us, that distinction, still doing the same work, still being applied by comfortable people to desperate ones. And it is one of the oldest and most convenient ideas we have. Let that hard change settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the loneliest place in the medieval world, and to people who deserve rather more kindness from history than they have had. There were people in that world who were separated from everyone, not for anything they had done, but because they were ill, and I want to speak about them carefully and briefly, because their lot was among the very hardest, and they have often been treated badly by history as well as by their own time. Leprosy, which we now know as Hansen's disease and now treat with medicine, was present in medieval Europe, and it was misunderstood, and it was feared enormously. A person diagnosed with it was, in many places, formally separated from the community. There were ceremonies for it, solemn and terrible, in which a person was declared dead to the world while standing there alive, and then sent to live apart, often in a leper house outside the town, dependent on charity, forbidden ordinary contact, carrying a clapper or a bell to warn others of their approach. It was a life sentence of exclusion handed down for the crime of being ill. And I want to add two honest things because the popular picture is cruder than the truth. The first is that it was not universally as cruel as the worst descriptions suggest. Leper houses were often religious foundations, and some were reasonably well provided for, and there was a strand of medieval thought that regarded the sufferer as specially close to God, bearing a burden in this life that would be answered in the next, and there was real charity as well as real cruelty. The second is that the separation was not madness. They did not know what caused it, but they had observed that it seemed to spread, and separation was the only tool they had. And it is the same tool we reached for ourselves not so very long ago, when we did not know what else to do. But none of that softens what it was to be the person, to be told, in front of everyone you loved, that you were now to live apart, to be given a bell so that people would know to move away from you, to spend the rest of your life at the edge of a world you had been born into. They deserve a moment of quiet, those people, more than most of the characters in tonight's story, and I hope you will give them one as you drift. Let those set apart settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the village priest, who was very often poorer than you imagine, and who deserves rather more credit than he usually gets. When we say the medieval church, we tend to picture wealth, cathedrals, bishops, abbeys with vast estates, the enormous institutional richness of it, and all of that was real. But the man who actually served the ordinary village, the parish priest, was frequently at the other end of that scale entirely, and his life was a good deal closer to his parishioners than to his bishops. A great many parish priests were poor, genuinely poor. The income of a parish was often small, and worse, a large share of it might be siphoned off elsewhere, to a monastery or a distant institution that held the rights to it, leaving the man actually doing the work with a thin living. So he farmed. He had his glebe, a portion of land that came with the church, and he worked it himself, with his own hands, alongside his neighbours, because otherwise he did not eat. So picture him, a man in the same muddy field as everybody else, doing the same labour, with the same weather and the same aching back, who then washed and went and said Mass. He was often local, drawn from the same peasant stock as his congregation. His education might be thin, and there are plenty of complaints from bishops about parish clergy whose Latin was shaky and whose grasp of doctrine was uncertain, which tells you the level a lot of them were operating at. And what he actually did was extraordinary when you list it. He baptized the babies. He married the couples. He heard the confessions, which meant he was the one person who knew what everybody in that village was carrying. He sat with the dying, in a world where dying was frequent and frightening, and where the rites mattered more than we can easily imagine. He buried the dead, including the children, over and over, for a lifetime, in the same small churchyard. He was, in effect, the entire counselling, pastoral, and emotional support service of a whole community on a poor man's income, while also growing his own food. There were bad ones. Of course there were bad ones, and medieval literature enjoys them enormously, the greedy priest and the lazy one, and the one with a scandalous private life, and they were real. But there were also, in enormous numbers, ordinary decent men doing that job well and dying unknown. And Chaucer, who is merciless about the pardoner and the summoner and every other clerical grifter in his poem, includes among his pilgrims a poor parson, and he writes about him with complete and unguarded admiration, and it is one of the warmest portraits in the whole work. I like knowing that the great satirist of the medieval church looked at the poor village priest, working his own land, walking miles in the rain to visit the sick, and did not make a joke. Let that poor parson settle gently in the dark. We turn now to a man who sold forgiveness out of a bag, and who everybody in Europe seems to have found insufferable. The pardoner was a man licensed to collect money for the church, and in return for your donation, you received an indulgence, a document remitting some portion of the penance owed for your sins. That was the theory, and in its proper form, it was a recognized part of the religious life of the age. In practice, a great many pardoners were, to put it gently, working freelance. They travelled. They arrived in a village, set themselves up, and preached, and they were often extremely good at it, because their income depended entirely on their performance. They painted the terrors of the next world with real vividness for an audience that believed in it completely, and then they offered the remedy, and the remedy cost money, and a good many of them carried relics, which they displayed, and which they claimed had wonderful powers, and which were frequently, transparently, nonsense. Pig bones presented as the bones of saints, bits of cloth, fragments of things that could not possibly be what they were said to be, and the medieval public, who were not fools, knew this. That is the striking part. Contempt for pardoners is everywhere in the literature of the age. Chaucer's pardoner is one of the great portraits of a hypocrite in English writing, a man who preaches passionately against greed as a technique for extracting money, and who cheerfully admits to the reader that this is exactly what he is doing. The character works because Chaucer's audience recognized the type instantly and despised it. So here is a man in a position of religious authority selling relief from spiritual terror to frightened people, with props he knows are fake, and who is widely and openly regarded as a fraud, and who keeps doing it anyway because it works. He is not one of the sympathetic figures of tonight's story. He is here as the exception, the one man in our gallery who genuinely earned his bad reputation, and I include him partly for balance, because I do not want you to think the medieval world was simply a machine that crushed innocent people. Some of the people it disliked were disliked for excellent reasons, and there is a small satisfaction in knowing that the abuse of indulgences eventually became one of the sparks of the Reformation, and that the whole business of selling forgiveness by the sheet helped to blow the medieval church apart. The pardoner, in the end, cost his own institution a great deal more than he ever collected for it. Let that travelling salesman of forgiveness settle gently in the dark. We turn now, briefly and with care, to the community that suffered worst of all in medieval England. I want to say one thing plainly before we go on, because this episode is about people who had a hard lot in the medieval world, and it would be dishonest to run through gong farmers and millers and leave out the community that suffered most. Jewish communities in medieval England lived under restrictions and prejudices that shaped every part of their lives, were subject to violence, and were finally expelled from the country entirely in 1290 by order of the king, forced to leave their homes and go. Similar patterns of persecution and expulsion occurred across medieval Europe. I am not going to detail any of it tonight. It is not what this episode is for, and it is not a story that should be handled in passing between a joke about millers and a chapter about sleep. But it would be wrong to give you a tour of medieval misfortune and quietly skip the worst of it as though it had not happened, so I am telling you plainly that it did, and that it was not a misfortune of birth or trade, but a deliberate cruelty done by people to other people, and that it deserves better than a footnote. If you ever want to know more, it is well documented and properly told elsewhere by people who have given it the space it needs. For tonight, I will simply say that they were there, that they suffered greatly, and that they should be remembered. Let that be said, and let it settle gently in the dark. We turn now, more gently, back to the ordinary working world and to a woman who brewed the ale. Here is one that surprises people, because it corrects two assumptions at once. For much of the medieval period, brewing ale was women's work, and it was one of the very few trades a woman could run in her own right. Ale was drunk constantly, by everyone, in enormous quantities. It was not the strong stuff you are imagining, most of it, but a weak everyday drink, nourishing and safe and normal, and it did not keep. Ale without hops goes off in days, so it had to be brewed continually, in small batches, close to where it was drunk, and that meant it was made at home, in domestic kitchens, in ordinary houses, alongside the cooking, by the woman of the house. And a woman who was good at it could sell the surplus. And a woman who was very good at it could make a genuine living brewing for the village, hanging out a sign when a batch was ready. And these women were called alewives or brewsters, and for a while they were a real and recognized part of village economic life, one of the very few routes by which a woman could earn independently. And then two things happened, and both went against her. The first was hops. Hops preserve beer, and beer with hops keeps for months and can be brewed in large batches and transported and stored and sold at scale, which turns brewing from a domestic craft into an industry, and industries require capital and premises and equipment, and in that world, capital and premises and equipment overwhelmingly meant men. The alewife brewing 5 gallons in her kitchen could not compete with a brew house, and the trade moved out of women's hands and into men's, and largely stayed there for centuries. The second thing was uglier. As the trade professionalized and competition sharpened, the reputation of the alewife curdled. She was mocked in verse and image as dishonest, giving short measure, watering her ale. She was portrayed as loud, disorderly, disreputable. And there is a long-standing suggestion, much discussed and much argued over, that some of the visual clichés we now associate with the witch, the pointed hat, the cauldron, the cat, the broom outside the door, may have their roots in the working equipment and signage of the alewife. Historians differ on how far to push that, and I will not push it far, but the general point stands on firmer ground. A group of independent working women were pushed out of their trade and simultaneously acquired a thoroughly nasty reputation, and the two things were not unrelated. So the alewife joins our company, not because her job was disgusting, like the gong farmers, or shunned, like the executioners, but because she is an example of something else that happens to people at the bottom of a society, which is that when something valuable is taken away from you, it is very often accompanied by a story explaining that you never deserved it in the first place. Let that woman with her ale stake settle gently in the dark. We turn now, for once, to somebody whose lot was better than you would expect, because it would be unfair to leave you thinking that world contained nothing but bad hands. Amid all this misfortune, here is a genuinely surprising one, and it is the only figure tonight whose position was, in certain real respects, better than the alternatives available to her. The medieval widow, in many places and many periods, held a status that neither the unmarried woman nor the wife possessed. Because a married woman's legal personality was, in most of medieval Europe, largely absorbed into her husband's, she generally could not hold property independently in the way he could not make contracts freely, could not trade in her own name without complication. Her legal existence ran through him. And when he died, a great deal of that came back to her. A widow could hold land. In many customs, she was entitled to a portion of her husband's holding for her lifetime, and in some places to the whole of it. She could run the business. If her husband had been a member of a craft guild, she could often continue the trade, take on apprentices, keep the workshop going, and there were widows across medieval Europe running substantial commercial concerns in their own names. She could sue and be sued. She could make a will. She could, and this is the important one, refuse to remarry. And a widow with property and a functioning business had a strong practical reason to refuse. And many of them did, sometimes vigorously, sometimes against considerable pressure. So the medieval widow could end up as the one thing that was very hard for a woman to be in that world, an independent adult with money, property, a trade and legal standing, answerable to nobody in her own household. I am not painting a rosy picture here. Widowhood usually arrived with grief, often with children to feed, sometimes with immediate hardship and vulnerability, and a poor widow with no property had one of the very hardest lots of anyone. The freedom I am describing belonged mostly to those whose husbands left something worth inheriting, and a woman gaining her independence only through a death is a fairly bleak arrangement to begin with. But it happened, and it was real, and there were women in that world who ran their own affairs, made their own decisions, held their own land, employed people, refused offers, and lived out their later decades as their own masters in a society not otherwise built for it. And I did not want you to reach the end of tonight thinking that every single person in that world was trapped, because some of them, by luck and grief and stubbornness, were not. Let that independent woman settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the vast majority of people in that world, who were not criminals or outcasts at all, but who were not free either. We should not leave the medieval world without saying clearly that the ordinary condition of an enormous number of people in it was unfreedom. A great many peasants were villains or serfs, and the exact meaning varied hugely by place and period, but the essentials were these. You were tied to the land. You could not leave the manor without permission. You owed labour to the lord, a set number of days working his fields rather than your own, at exactly the times of year when your own crops most needed you. You owed dues and payments at various points, and there were fees for things that we would find astonishing to be charged for. There was a payment when your daughter married. There was a payment when you died, the best beast of your holding taken from your grieving family as a matter of custom. You were not a slave. That distinction is real, and it matters. You had a house, and land you worked for yourself, and a family that was yours, and rights recognized in the manor court, and custom protected you in a great many ways, and you could go to that court and argue and sometimes win. But you were not free, and the difference between you and a free man was written into the law and into every part of your life. And I mention this, not to be gloomy at bedtime, but because it puts everything else tonight into its proper frame. When we talk about the medieval thief, we are usually talking about someone from this class, someone with very little, tied to a place, owing labour and dues, one bad harvest from hunger, and facing a legal system that would take his life for the value of a sheep. And the great slow story of the following centuries is that this arrangement dissolved, not by anyone's kindness. It fell apart because of plague and economics and rebellion, and the sheer stubborn pressure of ordinary people who wanted to leave and be paid. And by the end of the Middle Ages, serfdom in England had largely withered away. It took a very long time and a great deal of suffering, And it happened, and that is not nothing. Let that unfree world settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the court records themselves, and to what medieval thieves actually stole, which will tell you almost everything about who they were. If you read the surviving records of medieval courts, and people have read them very carefully indeed, a picture emerges of what was actually being stolen, and it is not the picture in the stories. There is very little treasure. There are very few jewels. There are almost no daring robberies of the sort that later centuries would romanticize. What there is, over and over and over again, is this: a sheep, a single sheep, or two, grain, sacks of it, taken from a barn, in the months when the last harvest was running out, and the next one was not in yet, cloth, sheets, blankets, a coat, a length of wool. And you have to understand what cloth was worth to grasp why it appears so often. We touched on it earlier. Every scrap of it represented enormous labour, and it was one of the most valuable portable things an ordinary household owned. Stealing someone's blankets in that world was not petty. It was taking a substantial piece of their wealth, and it was also, in a cold house in February, taking something rather more immediate than wealth. Poultry. Endless poultry. Hens and geese, taken at night, one or two at a time. Food, plainly and simply. Bread, cheese, bacon from the rafters. Things eaten, presumably within hours of being taken, by somebody who was hungry when they took them. Small tools, a knife, an axe. The things a working man needed to work with and could not afford to buy. And when you put that list together and look at it, you are not looking at a criminal underworld. You are looking at hunger and cold and a bad year. You are looking at people, mostly poor people, taking food and warmth and the means of work in the specific months when food and warmth ran short. Historians have noticed the seasonality of it, the way certain kinds of theft cluster in the lean part of the year, in the hungry gap before the harvest. And it is exactly what you would expect if you were looking at desperation rather than enterprise, which puts everything else we have talked about tonight into a rather grim frame. All that machinery, the hue and cry, and the tithing, and the 12 pence, and the court, and the road to the sea, and the wolf's head. Enormous, elaborate, and often deadly. And what it was mostly being aimed at, day in and day out, was a hungry person who had taken a hen. That is not a comfortable thought, and I am not going to pretend it away, but it is also, in a strange way, the thing that makes the next chapter possible, because the people running that machinery could see this as clearly as we can. The jurors valuing those goods at 11pence knew exactly what had happened and why. They were not being fooled. They were looking at a neighbour who had taken food, and at a law that said he should die for it, and they were quietly declining. Let that sad, short list settle gently in the dark. We turn now, at last, to the surprising truth about medieval justice, which is that it was far more merciful than its reputation. Here is the turn, and it is the thing I most want you to take from tonight, because it contradicts almost everything the popular picture tells you. The medieval legal system looks, on paper, like a machine for killing people. Theft above 12 pence, death. A long list of felonies, death. Terrifying language, terrifying formality, terrifying penalties written into the law in plain terms. And then you look at what actually happened to actual people, and the picture changes completely, because between the letter of the law and the fate of the person standing in the court, there was an enormous quantity of discretion, and almost all of it ran in the direction of mercy. Look at what we have already found tonight. The jury that valued the stolen goods at 11pence, 1 penny under the line, because they did not want to hang a neighbour. The church that would not give up a man who reached its door and gave him 40 days, and then a road to the sea instead of a rope. The psalm that anyone could memorize, that turned a capital case into a church court matter, and that everybody knew was a fiction and everybody permitted anyway. Beyond those, there were pardons which the crown issued in quantity, sometimes in return for military service, sometimes for money, sometimes simply because someone with influence asked. There was the plea of pregnancy, which delayed and often ultimately spared. There were juries who simply refused to convict at all in the face of clear evidence, because they had decided the punishment did not fit. Put it all together, and you find a system whose formal severity was matched by an informal machinery of escape so extensive that it must have been, at some level, deliberate. The law said one thing very loudly. Everybody involved in operating it, from the priest to the coroner to the jury of neighbours, quietly did something else. And I think the explanation is simply this. The law was written by a small number of people trying to frighten a whole country into good behaviour, and it was administered by ordinary people who had to look the accused in the face and who knew his mother. Terror was the policy. Mercy was what happened when the policy met a real human being standing in a room. And notice how many of the escape routes we have found tonight were not written down anywhere as mercy. That is the fascinating part. The neck verse was officially a test of clerical status, not a pardon, and everyone pretended it was a test right up until the day it was abolished. The valuation of goods was officially a factual finding, not a reprieve, and the jury delivered it with a straight face. Sanctuary was officially a matter of holy ground, not of clemency. In every case, the thing that saved the person was dressed up as something else entirely, some technicality or formality or point of procedure, and everybody involved played along. Which tells you something rather touching about how mercy actually works. It very often cannot announce itself. It cannot say we have decided not to enforce this rule, because then the rule collapses and the deterrent goes with it. So it hides, it puts on a disguise and calls itself a valuation, or a reading test, or a rite of the church, and it walks the prisoner out of the building while everyone politely looks the other way. That is not a bad thing to know about our species, and it is a good thing to carry down into sleep. When the rules are cruel, the people asked to apply them will very often, quietly, and without announcing it, find a way not to. They will not make speeches about it. They will simply decide that the cloak was worth 11pence and go home to their supper. Let that hidden mercy settle gently in the dark. We turn now to the last and most comforting fact of the whole night, which is how few people this ever touched at all. For all that we have talked about tonight, the thief and the outlaw and the gallows and the hue and cry, I want to end the historical part of our story with the thing that is easiest to forget and most important to remember. Almost nobody did any of this. The overwhelming majority of people in the medieval world never stole anything, were never accused of anything, never appeared before a court in their lives, except perhaps to witness a land transfer or pay a routine fine for letting their animals stray. They got up and worked and ate and went to church and had families and gossiped and grumbled about the miller and went to bed over and over for a whole lifetime, and the dramatic apparatus we have been describing all evening simply never came near them. The court records survive, and they are wonderful, and they are also enormously misleading, in the same way that a newspaper is misleading. They record what went wrong. They are, by definition, the exceptions. Nobody wrote down that 10,000 people in the county spent Tuesday quietly working and did nothing whatsoever of note. That is not a record anyone keeps. And so when we read the past through its court rolls, we see a world apparently seething with crime and punishment, when what we are actually seeing is the thin, unusual crust on top of an enormous, ordinary, largely peaceful daily life. The medieval village was not a place of constant fear and violence. It was a place where a small number of things went wrong and were dealt with, sometimes harshly, sometimes with quiet mercy, and where the vast majority of people, on the vast majority of days, were simply getting on with it. And think what the unrecorded part of that world actually contained. All the things nobody bothered to write down, because nothing had gone wrong. Somebody mending a fence properly, somebody carrying a bucket to a neighbour who was ill, children running about in a lane in the evening, two old men who had argued about a boundary for 30 years, sitting companionably in the same alehouse anyway, a woman singing while she worked because the work was long and singing helped, the harvest coming in year after year, with everybody out in the fields together and the whole village fed for another winter. Somebody being kind to somebody for no particular reason at all on an unremarkable Thursday in 1340. None of that is in the court rolls. None of it was ever going to be. The records only ever catch the exceptions, and so the past comes down to us as a highlight reel of its own worst days, and we read it and conclude that people back then lived in constant misery and danger, when what we are really reading is a list of the few times that anything happened at all. And I find that steadying, and I hope you do too, because the same is true now. The news you read is a record of exceptions. It is what went wrong, gathered from an entire planet and delivered to you as though it were the ordinary state of things. And underneath it, invisible and unrecorded, billions of people are quietly getting on with an ordinary day, being decent to each other, and nobody is writing any of it down. Let that quiet, ordinary world settle gently in the dark. We turn now, softly, away from all of it and toward your own rest. There is nothing left to worry about tonight. No one is going to raise the hue and cry. There is no shout going up outside, no village turning out into the lane, no 9 men of your tithing being told they must find you by morning. Nobody is walking the road to the sea with a wooden cross in their hands. Nobody is counting pennies to decide whether a life is worth more or less than 12 of them. All of that is finished. Every single person we have spoken about tonight, the thief and the gong farmer and the executioner and the miller and the alewife and the man in the church counting his 40 days, is long gone, and their trouble is over, and it has been over for 600 years. The village is gone, the gallows is gone, the stocks in the market square are gone. The whole enormous, frightening, merciful, absurd machinery of it has fallen quiet and become nothing but a story that a voice can tell you in the dark to help you sleep. And you are here, safe and warm and unaccused, in a soft bed, in a locked house, in a world where nobody is going to come for you over a stolen hen. You have no 40 days to count. There is no road you must walk. There is no verse you need to have memorized. So let it all go now. Let the running feet and the shouting fade. Let the church door close gently on the frightened man, and let him have his rest too. Let the gong farmer finish his round and go home. Let the charcoal burner sleep beside his slow, warm mound in the trees. Let the reeve stop worrying about the harvest, and the constable hand back his staff at the end of his year, and the poor parson set down his spade at last. Let the whole medieval night settle and go quiet, the way it did every night, when the shouting stopped, and the village went to bed, and the fields lay dark, and nothing happened at all until morning. They all got to stop, in the end, every one of them. Whatever their day had held, however hard the work, or heavy the shame, or long the road, the light went, and the dark came, and they lay down, and the enormous ordinary mercy of sleep took them exactly as it is about to take you. Let your body grow heavy now, and still. Let the last of the day's weight sink out of your shoulders, out of your hands, out of your legs, down into the soft and holding dark. Let your breath move slow and low and easy, all on its own, asking nothing of you. There is nothing to guard tonight, nothing to hide, nothing to answer for. Nobody is coming, and nobody is looking for you, and there is nowhere you have to be. No oath to remember, no verse to have learned by heart in case you ever needed it. No 12 men to find who would swear that you are the sort of person who would not do such a thing, because nobody is asking, and nobody doubts it, and you have nothing whatsoever to prove to anyone before morning. The whole apparatus is dismantled. The frame in the market square is gone, and the road to the sea, and the 40 days, and the shouting in the lane, all of it, finished and quiet and harmless, 6 centuries away. You are safe, in a way that almost nobody in that old world ever quite was. You are warm, with no fire to tend, and no wood to have gathered. You are held by a soft bed in a quiet room in a locked house, on a perfectly ordinary night that no one will ever think to write down anywhere, because nothing at all is going to go wrong in it. You are safe, you are warm, you are held. Good night, traveller. Rest easy, sleep deep. I'll be here, somewhere in the quiet, when you wake.